In the fall of 1963, South Vietnam was in a state of near anarchy. The Viet Cong controlled the countryside and were operating freely. Despite having received hundreds of millions in U.S. aid, the Saigon regime stood close to collapse. Less than 48 hours after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was briefed on the situation in Vietnam. The new president was shocked at what he heard, but his security advisors told him that all was not yet lost. There was a plan in the works, Kennedy's plan. It had been conceived by a secret committee of high-level intelligence and Pentagon officials, the 303 Committee, which took its name from the room where they gathered in the old executive office building across from the White House.
The 303 Committee was made up of the leadership of the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and Central Intelligence Agency, and of course the White House was represented by someone from the National Security Council.
Kennedy at one point said, well, what about up north? What are we doing against the North Vietnamese? Can we, in effect, do to them what they're doing to us? And subversion, guerrilla warfare.
The plan the 303 Committee authorized for Kennedy, 34 Alpha, was an aggressive outline for paramilitary strikes into North Vietnam. 34 Alpha contained 72 covert operations. Nearly all of them were considered high risk.
If you read that plan, you will see that it is reflective of what Kennedy had in mind. He had all the tricks in the bag.
But Lyndon Johnson had doubts about the plan.
Now, the reason he has second thoughts is domestic politics. Johnson now knows that he's going to be the candidate for the Democrats in '64. And he's also knows that there are those Republicans out there who are much more aggressive about what to do in Vietnam. And of course, the person he's going to have to run against, Barry Goldwater, is ultimate hawk on Vietnam.
Johnson had publicly opposed the war, and he was worried that if covert operations were uncovered, he would lose face with the voters. He directed the plan be made as risk-free as possible.
If you're going to get something worthwhile accomplished, there has to be some risks, and you have to be prepared to minimize those risks, but you have to be willing to take that. And Johnson was not. He considered that we must do nothing that might jeopardize his popularity. He wanted to be remembered for his great society efforts, for his socialistic attitudes and performance, and did not want to be involved in this war, and he certainly didn't want to be involved in a conflict that would embarrass him by having people where we said they weren't.
The Op Plan 34 Alpha, approved by Johnson, was a greatly watered-down version of the original. It was the new president's first executive action on Vietnam, and it set a standard for U.S. conduct of the war over the next 4 years. It would be a war of half measures, fought by men whose first priority was concealing the fact that they were waging a war. As for Op Plan 34 Alpha itself, it was destined for failure, and not because President Johnson took the teeth out of it. 34 Alpha failed because the enemy knew about it from the beginning. In early 1961, at the urging of President Kennedy, the Central Intelligence Agency ran a series of covert operations into North Vietnam. They were designed to send a message to the communist leaders that subversive activities south of the 17th parallel would no longer be tolerated.
The specific operations that CIA was conducting primarily under a thing called Project Tiger, were to infiltrate North Vietnam and to attempt to create within North Vietnam the same kinds of guerrilla problems that the South Vietnamese were having with the Viet Cong in the South.
In Saigon, during August of 1960, a North Vietnamese refugee, Pham Choy En, was recruited by a CIA case officer for Project Tiger. The following year, Pham Choy En, now codenamed Agent Aries, was inserted into North Vietnam by boat somewhere near the Chinese border.
So the first agent gets dropped in, and we don't hear a damn thing from him. Ever. We didn't know then, we now know, that the whole operation of dropping people in the North was penetrated by the North Vietnamese from the very beginning. How? Because the deputy chief of the South Vietnamese unit that was created by the South Vietnamese to drop their people into the North, the deputy chief of that whole damn thing, it was a North Vietnamese agent.
For the next 3 years, subsequent teams of agents dropped into the North were compromised and captured almost immediately. Some of them were turned into double agents. These agents radioed back misleading information to the CIA Saigon station and its chief, William Colby.
There was no point in trying to put people into North Vietnam if the North Vietnamese knew who and when we were coming from the South. And that's precisely what happened. There wasn't a thing being done or talked about between the South Vietnamese government and the United States advisors that the North didn't know the same day. That's how badly penetrated the South Vietnamese government was. But Bill Colby, as chief of station, didn't believe in counterintelligence and didn't believe in spying on your friends.
It was soon obvious to all that Operation Tiger was a failure. Dissatisfied with the CIA's lack of results, President Kennedy had ordered responsibility for the covert war in Vietnam transferred to the Army. But now Kennedy was dead. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, reluctantly approved the order.
The military had massive resources in a way that the Central Intelligence Agency never did. That was one part of it. The other part of it is fallout from the Bay of Pigs. The miscarriage of the CIA invasion of Cuba operation resulted in a policy decision that large-scale paramilitary operations should always be carried out by the U.S. military and not the Central Intelligence Agency.
On January 24, 1964, the U.S. Army's Military Assistance Command in Saigon, known as MAC, issued General Order 6, creating a secret organization to wage covert war. It was called the Studies and Observation Group, or simply SOG. SOG's primary mission was the implementation of Op Plan 34 Alpha. The CIA was ordered to hand over Project Tiger's assets to SOG, but there was almost nothing reliable to hand over.
The CIA told MACSOG, we're having trouble with this operation, but you think you can do it better? Go with God. So MACSOG takes over, and CIA moves into the background on a lot of these operations in the North.
By the time then Colonel Jack Singlaub arrived in Saigon to take over as the third commander of MACSOG, it was becoming apparent that most, if not all, of the agents in place were working for the other side.
They, in many cases, had been compromised, and while the radio operator still operated his radio, and we could determine that by detecting his handprint, as they say, on the CW operator, the team was really doing what the North Vietnamese Intelligence Service directed them to do, and they would put in requests for gold wristwatches or something of value to be dropped into them for various reasons. So we could tell pretty well, not just from the requests they made, but for the response they would give to some of our questions.
Once he determined that SOG and the CIA before it were victims of a double cross, Colonel Singlaub chose what may have been his only option. he set in motion a plan to deceive his deceivers by turning Op Plan 34 Alpha into a triple cross. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Lyndon Johnson arranged his priorities for his new administration. The Vietnam War was not one of them. Two previous U.S. administrations had financed the South Vietnamese government and trained its army. Now it was Lyndon Johnson's turn. But the new president had his own priorities, and a foreign war was not one of them. On his first night in office, LBJ stayed up late with his assistants, Bill Moyers and Jack Valenti.
He'd been president for 11 or 12 hours. He sketched out to us what he planned to do as president. He was going to pass a civil rights bill that was languishing in the Senate. He was going to get a bill that let everybody vote. He was going to pass Harry Truman's medical insurance bill that became Medicare. And he was going to have education bills and so forth, sketching out what later became the Great Society. But that night, we barely spoke of Vietnam. It was a subject no bigger than a man's fist on the horizon.
But for Lyndon Johnson, the problem of Vietnam grew larger every day. It was clear that strong measures needed to be taken against the communist North for its continued subversion of the South. But Johnson, his security advisors, and the Joint Chiefs could not agree on what those measures should be. Each of them knew there was far more at stake than the success of LBJ's political agenda or the future of South Vietnam. North Vietnam was backed by America's Cold War adversaries, China and the Soviet Union. Any direct confrontation carried the potential for igniting a much greater conflict.
President Johnson was convinced in his mind that there was some treaty between the North Vietnamese and the Chinese that could involve the Chinese in the war if we did things in North Vietnam that provoked the Chinese. So fear of China dictated a lot of the decisions in Vietnam.
And so the decision was made to punish the North for its backing of the Viet Cong, but to do so in secret, thereby avoiding direct confrontation with Hanoi's patrons, China and the Soviet Union. Kennedy had called it as sending messages to Hanoi. Now Johnson, too, embraced the idea of the covert war because it allowed him to deny he was waging war at all. Still, he worried about the possible repercussions should the secret war get out of hand. He gave orders through Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara that covert activities be limited to North Vietnamese territory. Laos and Cambodia were off limits. China was out of the question. Johnson and his advisors and cabinet kept tabs on day-to-day operations. Even the smallest action required approval from Washington. The North Vietnamese did not share LBJ's reservations about cross-border raids. Their main line of communication into the South, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, ran through both Laos and Cambodia. One of Mac Sog's first recommendations to the president was that paramilitary operations be launched immediately against the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos.
The problem with Laos always was that in 1962 there was a new Geneva Agreement neutralizing Laos. Because Laos was supposed to be neutral, that meant that no foreign military forces were supposed to operate inside the country.
After much deliberation, Washington approved limited intelligence patrols into Laos, with the stipulation that Americans could not lead the teams. The code name for this, Sog's first covert operation into Laos, was Leaping Lena. From the beginning, the Leaping Lena missions were hamstrung by unrealistic expectations, coupled with Washington's fear that the operation would be exposed and world opinion turned against them.
When the Vietnamese troops who were supposed to carry out the Leaping Lena mission heard that the Americans would not be accompanying them on the mission, they didn't want to go. Their morale plummeted. When the mission was carried out anyway, the first thing that happened was that the North Vietnamese responded in force to the Leaping Lena reconnaissance probes, and none of the teams came back.
Leaping Lena was a disaster. It would be many months before Mac Sog sent another mission into Laos. In the meantime, the Johnson administration directed that Sog continue running covert operations into North Vietnam, in the hope that these pinpricks would eventually convince Hanoi to stop sending supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Plan 37, conducted first by the CIA and later by the Navy, called for boat raids up through the Gulf of Tonkin into North Vietnamese territory.
They operated out of Da Nang, and they had these unmarked boats that would go up into North Vietnamese waters and do a bunch of different things. They did kidnapping operations, sabotage operations. They would try to blow things up along the coast, and the North Vietnamese would chase them. And it was one of those operations in chasing these boats that they came across the Maddox, and it was serendipity.
The USS Maddox was a Navy destroyer operating in the Gulf of Tonkin. On the 2nd of August, 1964, it was confronted and fired upon by 3 North Vietnamese gunboats. The Maddox returned fire, sinking at least one of the gunboats. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was the first overt and deliberate exchange between the United States and North Vietnam, and the enemy had fired the first shot. LBJ now had the excuse he needed to openly retaliate and punish the North. But with the presidential election only months away, he feared voter reaction to an open act of war. So he waited. 2 days later, on August 4th, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS C. Turner Joy, were reportedly fired on again by North Vietnamese gunboats. This second incident forced Johnson's hand. Caution, he knew, was an admirable trait in a president, but the voters would not tolerate weakness.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
When the word of these attacks reached Washington, the President's National Security Advisor recommended the implementation of Op Plan 37, which called for selective airstrikes against North Vietnam, which of course we carried out on August 5th. And that led to the widening of the war.
The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, passed almost unanimously by the United States Congress, gave Lyndon Johnson carte blanche to wage the war he never wanted.
And he does whatever he wants. I mean, he puts 500,000 people in there. He puts a huge air armada in there that conducts Rolling Thunder, the bombing of the trail in Laos.
If there was a single event that drew the United States into direct war with North Vietnam, it was the second Gulf of Tonkin attack. Yet the attack was only hours old when the Navy began to have doubts about whether it had actually taken place. Soon after news of the attack was relayed to Washington, the crews of the Maddox and the C. Turner Joy were debriefed by their commanders. Not a single crew member on either ship could confirm that they had actually seen or heard communist gunfire.
There are people who say that there never was a Gulf of Tonkin incident to begin with. It was all some sonar man misreading the dials that he was watching. And in some cases, they say, yeah, there was more than 2. And I don't believe there was ever, probably not even 1.
Now, with the bipartisan backing of Congress and the approval of 85% of the American public, Lyndon Johnson began to wage an open as well as a secret war against North Vietnam. Throughout 1964, the North Vietnamese continued to expand the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then, in the summer of 1965, the covert military group known as Mac Sog asked President Johnson for permission to resume sending insurgent teams into Laos to disrupt NVA supply lines into the south. But this time, remembering the failures of Leaping Lena, SOG insisted the teams be led by U.S. Special Forces personnel. Upplan 35 was drawn up by MacSOG Command and submitted through channels for approval. It called for the insertion of 12-man reconnaissance teams into Laos. Each team would include at least 3 Americans and be led by a Special Forces non-commissioned officer. The rest of the team would be made up of indigenous minorities, either Chinese Nungs or Montagnard tribesmen.
We not only didn't know what was going on under that triple canopy jungle, for example, and we knew that they were moving supplies down through there, but we could not photograph it. So we wanted to be able to put in teams that included Americans who would observe, and if lucrative targets were found, to call in airstrikes on those targets, ammunition depots and so forth, or take in the demolitions and set up ambushes, go in and actually destroy by placing charges on the bunkers.
The White House authorized Op Plan 35 in September 1965. 1 month later, the first team crossed the border into Laos. For the first time, U.S. personnel were able to get a good look at the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
After we started putting in these Op 35 teams, we had a much better idea of what was coming down and where it was, and we were able to really destroy large quantities of their supplies.
The trail was Hanoi's most vital possession, and the North Vietnamese Army guarded it jealously. Challenging the NVA on its own turf was the most hazardous of duties. Op Plan 35 teams often suffered heavy casualties because the enemy always seemed to know they were coming.
Along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where we typically we might have 5 or 6 SOG teams in the field, you would hear a shot in the distance. The shot was not the enemy shooting at somebody. They were warning that a SOG team had entered their territory, and the next day or the next couple of days, our SOG team would encounter significant forces of enemy troops out there looking for them.
Op Plan 35 met with mixed success, and it came at a heavy cost. The Laos cross-border operations were only months old when MacSOG commanders back in Saigon concluded that the year-old Op Plan 34 Alpha operations into North Vietnam had been a complete failure. Dozens of Op Plan 34 Alpha teams were inserted into North Vietnam by their CIA handlers, but few made it back. Now any and all remaining team members had to be considered double agents, working for the enemy.
The question was, maybe we ought to just close it down, this doesn't work. But they found out one very interesting detail, and that is that the North Vietnamese thought that SOG had put in many more agents than had actually been put in. All told, between CIA and SOG, they put in about 500. The North Vietnamese thought there were thousands. Now this is a very interesting fact. And they thought, gee, if the North Vietnamese think there are a couple thousand, let's try to make them think that there are many more than that. Let's create efforts that play on this North Vietnamese paranoia.
Op Plan 34 Alpha became a diversionary program. This new twist on the old plan was drawn up by MacSOG and approved by General Westmoreland. It was a triple cross designed to convince Hanoi that there were many more teams of spies operating in North Vietnam than actually existed. This new version of Op Plan 34 Alpha was designated Project Foray. In order for foray to be successful, not only would Hanoi have to be deceived, but so would Mac Sog's South Vietnamese counterparts, the Strategic Technical Directorate, whose ranks were thought to contain North Vietnamese spies. Project Foray called for the recruitment of North Vietnamese prisoners of war as SOG agents. The POW was told he was going on a mission into North Vietnam from where he was expected to radio back information. His SOG handlers were not concerned about the POW's loyalty because they expected him to get caught. In fact, that was the idea.
SOG played rough. I mean, one of the things that they did was they put North Vietnamese prisoners of war back into North Vietnam and loaded them up with things that would connect them to other agent operations, which meant that probably these people at least spent the rest of their lives in jail, if not being executed.
Project Foray also included diversionary programs that were run by the Psychological Operations section of MacSog. One of the more elaborate of these was the creation of a fake North Vietnamese resistance movement called the Sacred Sword Society. The alleged home base for the Sacred Sword Society was a place called Paradise Island. SOG radio transmissions described Paradise Island as a safe haven somewhere in North Vietnam, where refugees could find sanctuary among their brothers and sisters in the resistance. But in fact, it was an island in the Gulf just south of the 17th parallel. Blindfolded prisoners kidnapped from the coastal areas of North Vietnam were brought to Paradise Island for an intense session of psychological indoctrination.
These were people captured on the shores of North Vietnam or in North Vietnam fishing boats and would be taken back and all of their apparent physical ailments cured. They would be well fed in what was supposed to be a safe area in North Vietnam. On that island they would be given very good treatment and a lot of indoctrination.
On Paradise Island, the refugees were shown proof of communist abuses in South Vietnam and told that it was only a matter of time before the anti-communist resistance in North Vietnam was ready to revolt. When they returned to their villages in North Vietnam, they carried this story with them. The hope was that the enemy would expend his resources searching out this non-existent underground movement. By the end of 1967, MacSog insurgent, intelligence gathering, and PSYOP projects were at last gaining some momentum. But Lyndon Johnson was fast losing faith in the strategy of sending messages. Rolling Thunder, his intense bombing campaign in the north, had failed to bring North Vietnam to the bargaining table. And now more than ever, he was looking for a way out. The United States had pledged to protect and sustain the Republic of South Vietnam until such time as she could stand on her own. President Johnson, like Kennedy before him, disavowed any other ambition in the region. LBJ's pledge to stay out of neighboring Laos and Cambodia and even North Vietnam placed severe limits on U.S. and South Vietnamese armed forces. These limits created sanctuaries where the enemy could hide and marshal his strength. They also allowed the enemy the advantage of choosing where and when to fight. The war became one of attrition, fought on South Vietnam's soil but on North Vietnam's terms.
Our strategy was one of search and destroy, which was an attrition-based strategy. And I mean, it's a very simple idea. You kill them faster than they can replace them. And at some point, you then start to lower their order of battle to the point where they have to give up. Now, if your strategy is one of attrition, but your opponent is controlling the battlefield, and you have a time limit on how long you can stay, you've got a big problem.
Without territorial objectives or even clear battle lines, there was only one way to determine who was winning: body counts.
When you allow a sanctuary on your border, seizing a piece of ground in South Vietnam was not important. The important thing was to make sure it was not used by the enemy. You didn't have to occupy it. And so we then said, okay, if they want to hold on to that ground now, we'll blast them out of there, and we'll kill a lot of them, make them, force them to replace those people we've just killed. And this was the way in which the war was measured, the body count.
LBJ told Congress the U.S. was winning the war by a kill ratio of 10-1. But privately, he despaired that the war was slipping into stalemate. And the leaders in Hanoi knew that the Americans couldn't keep an army in Vietnam forever. To the communists, stalemate was almost as good as victory, and they were more than willing to wait.
10 years is nothing. Could be 20, could be 30. They were willing to keep on going. We were not. We couldn't. And there was no way we were going to beat them. Particularly with McNamara and his whiz kids doing things by creeping escalation. You can't, in a war, you don't creep. If you want to go into a war, you escalate from the beginning with everything you got, hit them hard, and then see what happens.
By 1967, the United States was spending over $1 billion a month in support of a South Vietnamese regime which was weaker and more corrupt than ever. It was becoming apparent that even if communist aggression were neutralized militarily, it would be a false victory. In the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people, the cause had already been lost. Meanwhile, in the streets of America, support for LBJ's war was disintegrating. The summer of '67 saw race riots in Detroit and Newark. Johnson's approval rating was plummeting. For the first time in their experience, many Americans saw themselves on the wrong side of a war. The country was split between protest and patriotism.
At the beginning of '67, the people did go tired of this confusion, and as a result, the protests began. And of course, when you instituted the lottery and started drafting young people, all of a sudden, the protests became louder and more clamorous because these young guys didn't want to go.
By the end of 1967, even Robert McNamara, co-architect of America's involvement in Vietnam, said the war could not be won. Before the year was out, LBJ replaced him with Washington attorney Clark Clifford, a close friend and self-described hawk. Within months, Clifford, too, advised Johnson to pull out of Vietnam. What had been an ugly war turned nastier. That same year, the CIA instigated a vigorous plan to root out Viet Cong intelligence agents from South Vietnamese villages. In what came to be known as the Phoenix Program, South Vietnamese military, police, and civilian officials trained by U.S. Army advisors purged an estimated 20,000 suspected Viet Cong. But the program was rife with corruption and injustice. As many as 70% of the Viet Cong suspects were able to buy back their freedom. Their places were taken on the arrest sheets by innocent peasants rounded up from the fields. Villagers were often arrested and even tortured based on no more evidence than the accusations of a jealous neighbor.
Sure, there was a lot of people who were unfortunately fingered by locals who wanted to settle scores with people, but basically the operation was a good counterintelligence type operation where you're trying to find out what the enemy's doing to you and you go after them. And when these people didn't want to be arrested, basically they were being arrested by the police, local police. If they put up a fight, then the local police starts fighting back and you have firefights.
Details of the Phoenix program would come to light 3 years later with the publication of the Pentagon Papers and the subsequent congressional investigation. But as 1967 came to a close, an anguished Lyndon Johnson came to a personal decision about his political future, one he hoped might change the course of the war. In the early hours of January 31st, 1968, President Johnson was awakened with reports that the North Vietnamese had at last broken the stalemate. They had chosen that day, the Vietnamese New Year called Tet, to stage surprise attacks on more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. Most of the attacks were beaten back immediately, and the Viet Cong, 80,000 strong, sustained enormous losses.
I've never seen so many dead people after battles as I did in that conflict. We were celebrating it. We thought it was a tremendous victory. And it was about 10 days or 2 weeks later, we got clippings from the United States paper and letters of sympathy. The media had shown scenes of damage only, and only wounded Americans, and it was a shock to us to learn that the whole country had been indoctrinated with the idea that this was a great victory for the communists.
Americans had been lulled into a sense that the war might be hastening toward a conclusion. Now, intense media coverage of the Tet Offensive led many to believe that they had been lied to all along.
You know, like the fellow says to his wife, you're going to believe your lying eyes or you're going to believe me. The Tet Offensive was one of the greatest military victories of the United States. But on television is what you saw was the American embassy under attack by people who had infiltrated. And people say, well, my God, if they can attack the Saigon embassy, nothing is safe.
Lyndon Johnson's administration had spent 4 years defending and downplaying American involvement in the Vietnam War. Now, as a result of the Tet attacks, the truth was brought home to Americans via television. The United States was not winning the war. It was sunk to its chin in a quagmire from which there seemed to be no escape. CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite was in 1968 one of the most trusted and therefore influential people in America. A month after Tet began, Cronkite returned from a visit to Indochina and told his viewers what he had seen and heard.
After Walter Cronkite went to South Vietnam following the Tet Offensive and came back with reports that we were in a stalemate and our policy wasn't working, President Johnson said to me, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country.
And that's exactly what happened. You couldn't possibly get anybody in the United States side to suddenly say, after Tet, yeah, we got more men, they got more men killed than we got, and we got a lot of their ammunition, we captured a lot of their guns. It isn't going to sell in the United States anymore when Walter Cronkite says it's over.
For Lyndon Johnson, it was over. On March 31st, just 2 months after Tet began, he stunned the nation with a decision he had kept secret for months.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require. Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.
How you react when you know each day young men, 18, 19, 20, 23, their lives ending before the lives had actually begun, and you are the commander-in-chief. This is not pleasant. This is not something that you want to see happen. You're depleted by it. You're agonized. You are drained. And I think this affected him in a most emotional way. And this is why he determined that he no longer wanted to serve.
With this surprise announcement, Johnson was sending a last-ditch message to Hanoi, an offer of a bombing halt, and, as a show of good faith, the resignation of a president. Quid pro quo for any movement towards peace.
Johnson wanted to get something for it. He was determined to shock the North Vietnamese into believing that he wasn't going to do political things and that maybe they could deal with this man.
He thought that this act on his part would let the North Vietnamese know he had no political ambitions, he had no political gain, and therefore they would believe him.
But like the messages before it, the counterinsurgency schemes, the troop buildups, and the relentless bombing, this one also fell on deaf ears. In the end, it was Hanoi who had sent the message. There was no cause for optimism. There would be no early end to the war.
Johnson was, I think, a tragic figure because he listened to people like that who convinced him that he could win this war through this graduated escalation. And if the war was important enough to win, then you had to try to win it. And I think they didn't advise him very well. And so he ended up suffering the consequences of that.
I have no sympathy for President Johnson. The most important thing going on during his administration was the war that we were fighting in Vietnam. He should have used his position to support the war, to get it over with. His lack of support for the war is what gave encouragement to the anti-war movement, when in fact he could have used the power of his office to give speeches on the subject, to give encouragement to the people, and approve more of the complete operations rather than doing it halfway.
As part of his efforts to bring Hanoi to the peace table, along with the bombing cutbacks and his promise to resign, President Johnson ordered MacSog Command in Saigon to cancel any further covert missions into North Vietnam. Op Plan 35's daring reconnaissance missions against the Ho Chi Minh Trail would continue until 1972. Secret MacSog activities in Vietnam are today generally considered to have had little effect on either the direction or the outcome of the war.
President Johnson thought he had done right in Vietnam. He thought he had prevented it from becoming a wider war. He thought he had prevented the North Vietnamese from achieving a victory in South Vietnam, which was certainly the case. And he believed that he had avoided a confrontation with the Soviet Union with all the dire circumstances. He fought a limited war without starting World War III, and I think he felt that was an achievement. And I don't think he ever doubted for a minute that Vietnam was necessary to prevent further communist gains throughout Southeast Asia, which would have been against our national interest.
On January 20th, 1969, Richard Nixon took the oath of office as the 37th President of the United States. Later that afternoon, Lyndon Johnson retired to his Texas ranch, where he would spend the rest of his life, troubled by the failure of his Vietnam policies. When he died there, 4 years later, in January of 1973, American troops were still fighting in Vietnam.